Joan of Arc, 1412 to 1431. Chapter 1. The Voices of Destiny. In the small village of Domremy, nestled along the winding Meuse River in northeastern France, a girl was born who would change the course of a nation. The year was 1412, a time when France was torn by war and unrest, a land scarred by the endless battles of the 100 Years' War. This girl, Joan, grew up among fields of wheat and the low murmur of villagers tending to their daily lives. Yet even in the quietude of Domremy, destiny whispered to her. From her earliest years, Joan was unlike other children. She had an intensity in her gaze, a clarity in her mind that seemed to look beyond the walls of her simple home. The village people noticed it, and though they loved her, they often wondered what great purpose might lie hidden in the child who spoke with such authority. When she was only 13, Joan began hearing voices that were not her own, voices that came with clarity and purpose. They were the voices of saints, Michael, Catherine, and Margaret, calling her to serve her country and her God. These voices spoke of a nation in peril, of France subjugated under the threat of English domination and the betrayal of internal strife. They told her that she, a humble peasant girl, would rise to lead armies, to inspire men, and to restore the rightful king to his throne. At first, Joan was frightened, unsure of what these messages meant. But over time, the voices became a guiding force, a divine call that could not be ignored. As the years passed, Joan's determination and faith deepened. While other girls her age dreamed of domestic life or marriage, Joan was consumed by a sense of higher purpose. She learned to ride horses, a skill rare for girls in her village, and practiced with simple weapons, imagining the battles she would one day face. Her parents, though humble and cautious, sensed that their daughter carried a remarkable destiny. The village elders whispered tales of saints and miracles, but none could have foreseen the extraordinary path Joan would take.
The political landscape of France was grim. King Charles VII, a young and weak heir, struggled to assert his authority amidst the chaos of the 100 Years' War. The English controlled vast portions of French territory, and even within French ranks, loyalty was fragmented. Armies fought and fell, villages were burned, and the common people suffered under the weight of occupation and famine. It was a world of darkness, and into this world, Joan's light was destined to shine. One day, as she walked through the fields, a vision appeared before her eyes. In ethereal light, a sense of divine presence that filled her with both awe and courage. The voices spoke again, urging her to take action. She was to leave Domremy, to journey beyond the familiar fields of her childhood, and to seek out the Dauphin, the uncrowned Charles VII, to help him reclaim his throne. The mission was impossible, the journey dangerous, yet Joan felt a fire ignite within her, a certainty that nothing could extinguish. By the age of 16, Joan's resolution was unwavering. She began to speak openly of her visions, of her divine mission. Many dismissed her as a foolish girl, some even as a heretic, but others began to notice the conviction in her words. Her courage, her faith, and her fearlessness made an impression on all who met her. Even the local authorities could not deny the strange magnetism that surrounded her, the unshakable certainty with which she spoke of France's liberation. Joan of Arc, the peasant girl from Domremy, was no longer simply a child of her village. She had become a symbol of hope, a beacon calling for courage in the face of despair. The voices that had guided her now demanded that she step into the wider world, into a France teetering on the brink of ruin. What followed would be a journey that defied expectation, challenged the norms of her time, and reshaped the destiny of a nation forever.
Chapter 2. The Journey to Destiny. The morning sun spilled gold across the fields of Domremy as Joan tightened the straps of her simple riding cloak. Her heart pounded with a mixture of excitement and fear. Leaving home was no small matter. To a peasant girl of 16, venturing into the world beyond her village was a bold, almost reckless act. Yet Joan felt no hesitation. The voices that had guided her for years were insistent, almost urgent. They promised purpose, victory, and the restoration of France. But the path to that destiny was treacherous and uncertain. She mounted her small horse, gifted to her by a sympathetic neighbor who believed in the girl's mission, and took one last glance at her family's modest home. Her parents, proud yet anxious, could do nothing but offer a silent blessing. "Go with God, Joan," her mother whispered, her eyes brimming with tears. "May He guide you and protect you." Her father, stoic but deeply worried, clasped her hand briefly. "Remember who you are, and remember what you fight for." Joan's first steps took her across familiar fields, then over narrow, winding roads that led into the unknown. The landscape gradually changed as she rode further from Domremy, moving through dense forests and past small villages, some abandoned and scarred by war. She passed the remnants of English raids, homes burned to cinders and fields left untended. Everywhere she saw despair. Everywhere she felt the urgency of her mission. Her journey was not without obstacles. Bandits roamed the countryside, taking advantage of the chaos left by warring factions. More than once, Joan's courage and quick thinking kept her from harm. With the confidence instilled by her divine visions, she convinced travelers and guards alike that her journey was righteous and sanctioned by heaven. Each encounter, each challenge, only strengthened her resolve. Finally, after weeks of arduous travel, she arrived in the fortified town of Vaucouleurs. Here, Joan faced her first true test. The local commander, Robert de Baudricourt, was a cautious man, wary of young girls claiming divine guidance. He demanded proof of her legitimacy, of the visions that supposedly guided her. Joan, undaunted, spoke with a clarity and passion that stunned all who listened. She described in detail the plight of France, the corruption and betrayal that threatened the crown, and the divine mandate that had been bestowed upon her. Her words carried a conviction so profound that even the skeptical de Baudricourt could not ignore them. It was here, in Vaucouleurs, that Joan took her first concrete steps toward becoming a military leader. With the commander's reluctant support, she gathered a small escort of loyal men who believed in her mission. Though the group was modest in number, their faith in Joan was unwavering. She led them onward, guiding the travelers through treacherous forests and over rugged terrain, relying on both her intuition and the voices that had become her constant companions. At length, the group reached Chinon, a town near the Loire Valley, where the Dauphin, the future Charles VII, held court. The journey had been long, arduous, and fraught with danger, but Joan's determination never wavered. As she approached the castle gates, the weight of history pressed down upon her. This was no ordinary audience. This was the moment that could change the fate of a nation. The young Dauphin, uncertain of his own authority and beleaguered by his advisors, had little reason to believe that a peasant girl could offer him salvation. Yet Joan, radiating confidence and purpose, demanded an audience. Inside the grand hall, Joan's presence was electrifying. She did not bend or bow excessively. She did not plead or beg. Instead, she spoke with the authority of someone who had been chosen by heaven itself. She told the Dauphin of his destiny, of the battles he was meant to win, and of the coronation that awaited him in Reims. Her words were met with skepticism by many of the courtiers, but the young king could not ignore the fire in her eyes, the unwavering faith that seemed to illuminate the room. After careful deliberation, Charles allowed Joan to remain at court under the guidance of his trusted advisors. She was examined, questioned, and observed, but nothing diminished the certainty in her demeanor. She had come not as a mere girl, but as a force of destiny sent to rally a broken nation. Her journey to this point had been perilous, but the true trials were only beginning. As the days turned into weeks, Joan's presence began to inspire those around her. Soldiers, weary and demoralized, found renewed courage in her unwavering faith. Advisors, accustomed to political intrigue, were astonished by her clarity of purpose. Even Charles himself, initially hesitant and unsure, began to see the possibility of a France reborn through Joan's guidance. The young peasant girl from Domremy had crossed the threshold from obscurity into legend, and the tides of war were poised to turn. But Joan knew the path ahead would be filled with trials that would test her faith, her courage, and the very essence of her being. The voices that had guided her thus far whispered constantly, preparing her for battles she could scarcely imagine, both on the fields of war and in the treacherous corridors of power. The road to Reims, to the crown, and to France's salvation stretched long and dangerous before her. But Joan of Arc rode forward with a conviction that no fear could shake. In that moment, as the walls of Chinon loomed above her and the whispers of destiny pressed in, Joan understood the magnitude of what was to come. She was no longer merely a girl. She was a symbol, a beacon, and a force of divine purpose. The journey of Joan of Arc had truly begun.
Chapter 3. The Maiden of War. The chill of early spring lingered in the air as Joan of Arc prepared to leave the relative safety of Chinon for the battlefields that would define her legacy. Word of her arrival had spread like wildfire across the Loire Valley, and whispers of a divine maiden rallying the forces of France reached the ears of soldiers and peasants alike. Some called her a saint, others a fool, but none could deny the magnetic force that seemed to follow her every step. Her small contingent of loyal followers, initially skeptical, had grown steadily as news of Joan's courage and clarity spread. Soldiers who had known only defeat began to see her not as a mere girl, but as a leader. Her presence breathed life into their weary hearts, transforming hesitation into action and fear into resolve. The task ahead, however, was anything but simple. The English and their Burgundian allies had occupied strategic positions across France, and the French army was fractured, demoralized, and indecisive. Victory seemed an improbable dream, but Joan carried hope like a banner, unwavering and luminous. Joan's first campaign would be to lift the Siege of Orléans, a vital stronghold whose fall would spell disaster for the Dauphin. The city's walls, battered by months of relentless assaults, had withstood countless attacks, but the people within were on the brink of despair. Starvation and disease had sapped their strength, and rumors of impending surrender spread like wildfire. Yet Joan, mounted on her small horse and clad in her newly forged armor, rode to the gates with the confidence of someone who had walked with God himself. As she approached, the defenders of Orléans watched in astonishment. A girl, barely 17, rode fearlessly toward a city surrounded by enemies. There was no hesitation in her gaze, no tremor in her hands as she grasped her banner, emblazoned with the fleur-de-lis, a symbol of France and of divine purpose. The citizens, seeing this fearless figure, felt a spark of hope ignite within them. Joan's voice, clear and commanding, echoed over the walls. She spoke not of strategy or politics, but of faith, courage, and the certainty of victory. France shall be free.
and God himself shall guide us."
The French forces, inspired by her conviction, rallied at her side. Soldiers who had once quarreled over leadership now followed Joan without question. She moved among them with an almost ethereal presence, calming fears, issuing orders, and personally inspecting the troops. Every word, every gesture seemed infused with a purpose that transcended mortal understanding. Her reputation as a visionary, already widespread, grew with every interaction, and whispers of a maid of heaven spread through the ranks like wildfire. When the time came to face the English at the outskirts of Orléans, Joan led from the front. The clash was brutal, chaotic, and unforgiving. Arrows darkened the sky, the roar of swords clashing echoed across the battlefield, and the cries of the wounded filled the air. Yet through the chaos, Joan moved with a calm authority, rallying troops and directing attacks with a precision that belied her youth. Her banner became a symbol of hope, its image inspiring soldiers to feats of courage they had thought impossible. Where her presence was felt, the French forces surged. Where she led, victory seemed within reach. For 7 days the battle raged. Every attempt by the English to break the city's defenses was met with unyielding resistance, guided and inspired by Joan. Her audacity was unmatched. She rode into the thickest of the fighting, her voice carrying above the tumult, urging her comrades onward. And as each day passed, the impossible became real. Orléans, long under siege, began to see the first glimmers of liberation. Victory, however, was not won solely through brute force. Joan's keen understanding of morale and psychology, her ability to inspire devotion and instill courage, turned the tide as much as any sword or arrow. The English, taken aback by the appearance of a fearless young girl leading an army, grew cautious and disoriented. Their confidence wavered, and cracks began to appear in their previously impenetrable formation. By the 7th day, Joan's relentless determination and the unity she had forged among her soldiers culminated in a decisive breakthrough. Orléans was free. The lifting of the siege sent shockwaves across France. Ordinary citizens, soldiers, and nobility alike hailed Joan as a savior. Her fame spread like wildfire, and her legend grew with every retelling. Yet, amidst the triumph, Joan remained focused. She knew that Orléans was only the beginning, a first step on a path fraught with greater challenges. The Dauphin's coronation awaited in Reims, but the journey there would demand further courage, strategy, and unwavering faith. Joan's military campaigns continued with a combination of brilliance and audacity that astonished even the most seasoned commanders. Towns and strongholds that had once surrendered without resistance now opened their gates at her approach. Each victory was carefully calculated, balancing the divine guidance she claimed to receive with the harsh realities of war. She was not merely a figurehead, she was a tactician, a motivator, and a symbol of hope in a land torn by conflict.
But with every triumph came envy, doubt, and danger. Nobles who resented her influence sought to undermine her. French commanders, accustomed to authority, sometimes bristled at the command of a peasant girl. And the English, infuriated by their unexpected defeats, plotted relentlessly to capture or kill her. Joan faced each challenge with the same unyielding spirit, her faith in God unwavering, her determination absolute. She became more than a leader. She became a force of destiny, shaping the course of history with every step. As the campaign toward Reims progressed, Joan's reputation transcended mere fame. She was no longer just a girl from Domremy.
She was a symbol of national unity, a beacon of hope for a fractured France. Soldiers followed her into battles they might otherwise have fled. Citizens entrusted her with their lives and livelihoods. And even the Dauphin, once hesitant and unsure, began to see her as the key to his coronation, the instrument through which his destiny and that of France would be fulfilled. By the time the armies approached the threshold of Rheims, the path Joan had carved was illuminated by courage, faith, and the relentless pursuit of justice. The Maiden of War had arrived, and the tides of history were poised to change forever.
Chapter 4: The Road to Rheims. The spring winds carried whispers of destiny across the rolling hills of France as Joan of Arc and her army marched relentlessly toward Rheims, the sacred city where the coronation of the Dauphin would cement his claim as Charles VII, King of France. Every step of this journey was steeped in both hope and peril. The road was not merely a physical path, but a gauntlet of political intrigue, military obstacles, and the weight of expectation. Joan, aware of the immense responsibility upon her shoulders, rode with an unshakable calm, her gaze fixed on the horizon, her mind attuned to the divine guidance she claimed to receive. The army she led was a remarkable amalgamation of veteran soldiers, reluctant nobles, and newly inspired peasants. Their initial skepticism had transformed into reverence. Even the most hardened warriors could not deny the miraculous victories Joan had already wrought. Her leadership was not born of fear or intimidation, but of a rare blend of strategic acumen, magnetic charisma, and an unyielding conviction in her divine mission. As the army advanced, she held council with her commanders, often bypassing traditional hierarchies, to ensure the swift execution of plans that reflected both prudence and daring. Yet the path to Rheims was fraught with danger. English forces and Burgundian allies controlled key fortresses along the route, threatening to cut off the French army or force them into disastrous engagements. Joan's strategies were bold. She preferred rapid, decisive strikes that leveraged surprise and morale over protracted sieges. Each town she approached presented a complex puzzle of negotiations, intelligence, and show of strength. Where diplomacy failed, her courage on the battlefield proved decisive. She personally led attacks that often turned the tide, appearing at the front lines with her banner held high, a symbol of hope and divine justice. Her presence inspired soldiers to feats of heroism that defied conventional military logic. The psychological warfare she waged was as significant as any clash of swords. Villages and garrisons, hearing of a young girl sweeping through France with unwavering faith and miraculous victories, often surrendered without a fight. In these moments, Joan's approach was both merciful and firm. She offered protection to those who submitted and justice to those who resisted, demonstrating a keen sense of leadership that combined morality with strategy. Every victory, whether achieved through diplomacy or combat, strengthened her reputation and unnerved her enemies. Amid these campaigns, Joan's spiritual vision remained central to her identity. She often prayed for guidance, seeking clarity in the midst of chaos. Her faith was contagious. Soldiers and citizens alike felt a sense of divine purpose in her presence. Even Charles VII, initially hesitant and cautious, began to see the truth of her claims. The Dauphin, once burdened by uncertainty and the shadow of illegitimacy, now found courage and conviction in Joan's unwavering belief. Their alliance was delicate, a mixture of political necessity and mutual respect. Yet Joan understood that her mission was not to claim power, but to serve a higher purpose. Her loyalty to France and to God's will guided every decision. The road to Rheims was marked by both triumphs and tragedies. Skirmishes with English forces tested the army's resilience, while harsh terrain and scarce resources challenged their endurance.
Each victory was hard won, each step forward a testament to determination and divine favor. Joan herself was not immune to the toll of war. She rode tirelessly, often foregoing rest to inspire her troops, her armor bearing the marks of countless encounters. Yet fatigue and danger never shook her resolve. If anything, they sharpened her focus, intensifying her determination to fulfill the mission she believed was entrusted to her by God.
As the army drew nearer to Reims, the political stakes grew higher. The coronation of Charles VII was not merely a ceremonial act. It was a statement of legitimacy and authority in a kingdom fractured by years of civil strife and foreign invasion. Supporters of the Dauphin pressed for caution, fearing that any misstep could undo years of struggle. Opponents, both foreign and domestic, conspired to delay or prevent the ceremony. Joan navigated these tensions with a rare combination of diplomacy, firmness, and moral authority. Her reputation as the Maid of Heaven shielded her in many ways, as few dared to openly challenge a figure so widely seen as divinely guided. Alongside the political maneuvering, the army faced logistical and emotional challenges. Supplies were limited, fatigue weighed heavily, and the psychological pressure of the impending coronation tested every soldier. Joan, however, remained a source of strength. She addressed fears directly, offered encouragement, and led by example. Her personal bravery, riding at the forefront of dangerous engagements, visiting wounded soldiers, and maintaining unwavering faith reinforced her leadership. She transformed ordinary men and women into a cohesive force, united by purpose and inspired by her vision. Finally, the army reached the outskirts of Reims. The city's walls, once distant symbols of the monarchy's authority, now loomed as a tangible goal. The streets buzzed with anticipation, and the people awaited the arrival of the Dauphin and his miraculous guide. Joan, understanding the symbolic weight of every step, carefully planned the entrance. Her strategy was meticulous. The procession would not only assert Charles VII's legitimacy, but also demonstrate the divine favor that seemed to accompany her. Every detail, from the banners to the positioning of troops, was orchestrated to inspire awe, respect, and devotion.
The day of the coronation arrived. Joan, standing proudly beside Charles VII, bore witness to a moment that would forever alter the course of French history. The young king, once uncertain and beleaguered, now radiated authority and legitimacy. The ceremony, conducted with solemnity and grandeur, was more than a political act. It was a symbolic triumph of faith, courage, and divine purpose. Joan's role was central, her presence a living testament to the power of belief and determination. Yet, even in this moment of glory, Joan remained vigilant. She knew that the challenges were far from over. Her enemies, emboldened by their losses and jealous of her influence, plotted endlessly. The English and their allies continued to contest her campaigns, seeking any opportunity to capture or undermine her. Internal dissent within France, among those who resented her rise from obscurity, also threatened her mission. Joan understood that her journey was not yet complete. The coronation was a milestone, not the end. And the path forward would demand courage, wisdom, and unwavering faith. As the celebrations of Reims subsided, Joan began planning the next phase of her campaign, the consolidation of French territories, the defeat of remaining English strongholds, and the unification of a kingdom long divided by war and uncertainty. Her vision extended beyond the immediate victories. She sought a France strengthened, united, and guided by justice. Every decision, every strategy, every engagement would be influenced by this
overarching purpose. The road to Rheims had tested Joan's courage, leadership, and faith like never before. It had forged her into a figure whose influence transcended age, gender, and social standing. Her victories inspired a nation. Her courage reshaped the morale of armies, and her vision of divine mission redefined the possibilities of leadership. By the time she looked upon the city, adorned in its ceremonial splendor, she knew that history had begun to bend in the direction of destiny, and that she would be its instrument, for better or worse, until her final hour.
Chapter 5. The Siege of Orléans. The winds of war carried both hope and fear as Joan of Arc turned her gaze toward Orléans, the beleaguered city that had long resisted the might of English forces. Its walls, battered and worn, symbolized both the resilience of France and the perilous state of the Dauphin's kingdom. Joan understood that Orléans was more than a strategic location. It was a beacon. Its liberation would ignite the spirit of resistance across the nation and mark the first decisive turning point in a campaign that many thought hopeless. From the moment she arrived at the encampment, Joan's presence electrified the French forces. Soldiers, weary from months of skirmishes and deprivations, found renewed courage in her unwavering confidence. She moved among them with calm authority, listening to their concerns, inspiring their bravery, and instilling in every man a sense of purpose far greater than survival. Even those who had doubted her abilities found themselves swept up in the vision she painted, a France united, free, and guided by divine justice. The English forces, entrenched and fortified around Orléans, were seasoned warriors, accustomed to siege warfare. Their artillery and archers had inflicted grievous losses on the French defenders, and the city's inhabitants were worn thin by starvation and constant bombardment. Joan, recognizing the challenge, approached the campaign with both courage and meticulous strategy. She refused to underestimate her enemies, understanding that the city's liberation would require not only valor, but also careful planning and decisive action. Joan's strategy was unconventional, reflecting both her intuition and her unique vision. She encouraged bold assaults, often leading from the front, a figure of light and determination amidst the chaos of battle. Her banner, emblazoned with divine symbols, became a rallying point for soldiers, a living emblem of hope that inspired feats of bravery previously thought impossible. She was fearless in the face of danger, appearing where the fighting was fiercest, calming her troops and striking fear into the hearts of the enemy.
The siege itself unfolded over weeks of intense struggle. Each day brought new challenges: fortified English positions, entrenched archers, and unpredictable weather. Joan's leadership transformed the weary French army into a disciplined, cohesive force capable of executing daring maneuvers. She understood the psychology of warfare as keenly as its physical demands. She recognized that morale was as critical as strategy. A faltering spirit could doom even the most meticulous plan. Through speeches, personal acts of bravery, and an unwavering faith in divine guidance, she maintained the army's determination and focus. Joan also forged alliances with local commanders and civic leaders, demonstrating her rare talent for diplomacy under pressure. She negotiated access to supplies, coordinated reinforcements, and ensured that communication lines remained open despite the chaos of the battlefield. Her presence transformed not only soldiers, but the entire region, imbuing them with a sense of hope and purpose that had long been absent. One of the most critical moments came when Joan proposed a direct assault on the fortified positions along the Loire River. The plan was daring.
French forces would coordinate simultaneous attacks on multiple strongholds, catching the English off guard and undermining their defensive strategy. Many commanders were skeptical. The risks were immense, and the potential for disaster loomed large. Yet Joan's conviction was unshakable, and her ability to inspire those around her ensured that the army executed the plan with precision and courage. The assaults were fierce and bloody. Joan, at the forefront, often faced the brunt of the enemy's defenses. Her courage was legendary. She stood in the midst of gunfire and arrows, a guiding presence whose resolve never faltered. Her personal valor inspired soldiers to push beyond their limits, charging into situations that would have been impossible without her leadership. The city's fortifications, once considered impregnable, began to crumble under the relentless pressure of her strategy and the unwavering courage of her army.
As the siege progressed, Joan's reputation soared. Tales of her divine guidance, miraculous victories, and fearless presence spread throughout France and beyond. These stories, sometimes exaggerated, served a dual purpose. They strengthened French morale and intimidated her enemies. Yet Joan remained focused on the mission itself, never allowing pride or legend to overshadow the practical demands of leadership. She knew that every decision could mean life or death for her soldiers and for the civilians trapped within Orléans. The culmination of the siege was a moment of extraordinary drama and triumph. French forces, inspired and coordinated under Joan's leadership, executed a final, decisive assault on the English positions. The fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering heavy casualties, yet Joan's presence ensured cohesion and determination. Her banner became the symbol of unstoppable momentum, rallying soldiers who fought with a fervor that seemed fueled by divine will. Finally, the English lines broke. The city, long under siege, fell into French hands. Its inhabitants, exhausted and fearful, celebrated their deliverance, seeing Joan as both liberator and miracle worker. The victory at Orléans was not merely military, it was a turning point in the war, a moment that shifted the balance of power and rekindled the hope of a nation that had long teetered on the brink of despair. Joan's role in the siege cemented her status as a national heroine. She had transformed the fate of Orléans through a combination of divine inspiration, tactical brilliance, and personal courage. Yet she remained humble, attributing the victory to God rather than her own abilities. Even amidst the euphoria of triumph, Joan understood that her mission was far from complete. She knew that England's hold on French territories remained formidable, and that the path to national unity and liberation would require further sacrifice, ingenuity, and steadfast faith. As Joan and her army prepared to move forward, the memory of Orléans remained vivid, a testament to the power of leadership, vision, and the indomitable human spirit. Every street, every wall, every corner of the liberated city bore witness to a girl who had risen from obscurity to become the embodiment of hope and courage for an entire nation. The Siege of Orléans had proven that miracles could be engineered through faith, bravery, and relentless determination, and that Joan of Arc was destined to leave a mark on history that no force could erase.
Chapter 6. The March to Reims. With the liberation of Orléans still fresh in the hearts of soldiers and citizens alike, Joan of Arc turned her days to Reims, the city where French kings had been crowned for centuries. To the Dauphin Charles, the coronation in Reims was more than ceremony. It was legitimacy. Yet the road to the cathedral was perilous, threaded with towns and fortresses still under English control or their Burgundian allies. Every step forward demanded courage, strategy, and unrelenting faith.
Joan's army, though buoyed by their victory at Orléans, faced the dual challenge of hostile territory and logistical strain. Supplies were limited, and many soldiers had never marched far from familiar ground. The English and their allies were vigilant, eager to intercept this unexpected surge of French morale. Joan, however, refused to let fear dictate her course. She moved like a figure of destiny among her troops, instilling confidence and discipline while carefully studying maps, scouting enemy positions, and devising strategies that balanced boldness with prudence. Her reputation had now grown to legendary proportions. Tales of her miraculous foresight, of arrows that had never struck her, and of visions guiding her hand reached even those towns still loyal to the English. Villagers opened their gates to her army, bringing supplies, information, and sometimes reinforcements. Yet Joan knew that not every encounter would be so easy. She warned her commanders that victories came at a price, and that caution, combined with audacity, would be their greatest ally. The march towards Reims was punctuated by a series of tactical maneuvers that showcased Joan's emerging genius as a military leader. She avoided predictable paths, outflanked enemy garrisons, and engaged in skirmishes that kept the English uncertain and on edge. Every encounter was a lesson in leadership, for Joan demanded courage but tempered it with careful planning. She encouraged her soldiers to fight with faith, not recklessness, understanding that the psychological impact of a confident army often outweighed raw numbers.
Among the most harrowing challenges were the fortified towns that lay directly on the path to Reims. These fortresses, though not as formidable as Orléans, were defended by determined English troops and Burgundian allies, each aware of Joan's growing influence. The first major confrontation occurred at Jargeau, a town whose walls had seen repeated sieges. Joan, undeterred, personally led the assault, her banner held high, a symbol of divine favor. The defenders, though valiant, were unprepared for the unity and fervor of her forces. By combining frontal attacks with flanking maneuvers, Joan orchestrated a victory that not only captured the town, but also inspired neighboring settlements to rise in support of the Dauphin. The march continued, each step fraught with danger and opportunity. Battles at Meung-sur-Loire and Beaugency followed, each demonstrating Joan's ability to inspire and command. Her intimate knowledge of terrain, coupled with her uncanny ability to predict enemy movements, allowed her army to strike swiftly and decisively. Towns surrendered without fight, sensing the inevitability of her advance. Villagers spoke of her with awe, a young girl whose mere presence seemed to bend fate to her will. Yet it was not only military skill that defined Joan. Along the way, she showed compassion to civilians caught in the crossfire, she organized care for the wounded, ensured that the hungry were fed, and maintained discipline among her soldiers to prevent unnecessary cruelty. Her leadership was both fearsome and merciful, a combination that strengthened loyalty and inspired devotion among her followers. Her faith in divine guidance was evident in every decision. She frequently prayed with her troops, encouraged reflection, and insisted that victories were not for personal glory, but for the fulfillment of God's will.
As the army neared Reims, the political stakes became more evident. The English and Burgundian forces, alarmed by her rapid successes, attempted to intercept her. Aware of the danger, Joan displayed extraordinary tactical insight. She used diversionary maneuvers to mislead the enemy, set ambushes to weaken their positions, and maintained the morale of her soldiers through relentless encouragement. Her calm in the face of adversity was a steadying force, proving that courage could be cultivated and that fear was often the true enemy of victory. Finally, after a series of grueling marches and battles, Joan's army reached the outskirts of Reims.
The city, long under threat from English-aligned forces, was not yet fully secure, but Joan's reputation preceded her. Citizens and local authorities, inspired by her previous victories, welcomed her as a savior rather than an invader. Preparations for the coronation of Charles VII could finally proceed, a moment that would symbolize the legitimacy and unity of France in the eyes of the world. The coronation itself was an event of immense significance. Joan, though not of noble birth, was central to the ceremony. Her presence validated the Dauphine's claim and demonstrated that divine providence had guided France to this moment. The Cathedral of Reims, with its soaring spires and intricate stained glass, bore witness to a young girl who had defied conventions, inspired a nation, and turned the tide of a war that had long seemed unwinnable.
Yet Joan knew that the triumph at Reims was not the end of her journey. The English forces remained formidable, and many regions of France still required liberation. She understood that each victory increased her fame and the danger it brought. Enemies' whispered plots and the political intrigue surrounding her continued to grow. Still, Joan's focus never wavered. She remained dedicated to her mission, guided by visions, faith, and an unshakable belief in her purpose. The march to Reims had tested every facet of Joan's leadership: strategy, courage, faith, and the ability to inspire those around her. It proved that a single, determined individual, acting with clarity of purpose and divine conviction, could reshape the course of history. And while the coronation marked a symbolic victory, Joan's journey was far from complete. Ahead lay new challenges, threats, and betrayals, each demanding the same courage and vision that had brought her from the fields of Domremy to the pinnacle of national triumph. In the quiet moments after the coronation, Joan reflected on the road she had traveled. She had faced danger, doubt, and the limits of human endurance, and yet she remained steadfast. The Siege of Orléans and the march to Reims were victories, yes, but they were also reminders of the work still to be done. Her mission was far greater than any single city or battle. It was the salvation of France, the fulfillment of divine will, and the demonstration that even the humblest of individuals could alter the destiny of nations.
Chapter 7. The Siege of Paris and Rising Shadows. The triumph at Reims brought not only glory, but also heightened expectations. Joan of Arc, once a simple peasant girl from Domremy, had now become the symbol of a nation reborn. Yet with every victory came new challenges, and the road ahead was fraught with political intrigue, rival ambitions, and the ever-present threat of English and Burgundian forces. In the months following Charles VII's coronation, Joan and her forces turned their attention to Paris, the capital and the heart of France. Though the city was technically under French control, its leadership leaned toward the Burgundian faction, allied with the English. The citizens, wary of both internal strife and external conquest, viewed Joan's approach with a mixture of hope and apprehension. Her arrival was no longer a mere military maneuver, it was a psychological campaign, intended to demonstrate the inevitability of French unity under the Dauphin. Joan led her troops with the same combination of audacity and prudence that had carried them through Orléans and the march to Reims. She organized patrols to disrupt supply lines, engaged in skirmishes to weaken the city's defenders, and maintained strict discipline among her men. Her presence was electric. Soldiers reported feeling invincible when near her, as if her confidence and divine inspiration infused them with courage. Civilians whispered that the Maid of Orleans was a living instrument of God, and such rumors spread quickly, undermining the morale of those loyal to the English and Burgundians. But Paris was unlike previous targets. Its fortifications were formidable, its defenders resolute, and its streets familiar to the enemy forces. The siege required patience, strategy, and diplomacy. Joan understood that brute force alone would not suffice.
She sent envoys to negotiate with the city's leaders, appealing to loyalty, honor, and the legitimacy of Charles VII. Her words, delivered with both humility and unshakable conviction, struck at the conscience of the city. Some citizens began to secretly aid her army, providing intelligence on guard rotations, weak points in the walls, and hidden supply routes.
Despite these advantages, the siege was grueling. Days turned into weeks, and the strain on both soldiers and civilians grew palpable. Supplies ran low, and the psychological toll of constant vigilance weighed heavily. Joan, ever the beacon of hope, refused to allow despair to take hold. She rode among her troops, prayed with them, and reminded them that their mission was not merely conquest, but the salvation of their homeland. Her speeches, imbued with faith and moral clarity, rekindled the determination of even the most weary soldiers. The attacks on Paris were punctuated by small but significant victories. Joan led daring sorties against enemy outposts, capturing supplies and demonstrating the vulnerability of the city's defenses. Each triumph was a carefully calculated act, designed to maintain pressure while avoiding catastrophic losses. Her leadership inspired creativity and initiative among her commanders, who learned to anticipate her strategic insights and adapt accordingly. Even seasoned soldiers marveled at her ability to read the battlefield, predict enemy movements, and make split-second decisions that balanced risk and reward. Yet the political stakes continued to rise. Joan's growing fame stirred envy and suspicion among some French nobles, who viewed her influence over Charles VII with unease. Rumors circulated that she sought power beyond her station, and some questioned whether a mere peasant girl could wield such authority. Joan remained undeterred, focusing solely on her mission. Her dedication, unwavering faith, and track record of victories gradually silenced many critics, though she remained aware that not all enemies were across the battlefield. The siege also revealed the harsh realities of medieval warfare. Disease and exhaustion claimed as many lives as combat, and Joan witnessed the suffering of both soldiers and civilians. She took steps to mitigate these hardships, organizing care for the wounded and ensuring that the civilian population was treated as much compassion as possible. Her actions strengthened loyalty and reinforced the image of her as a divinely guided leader whose cause was righteous, not self-serving. After weeks of tense maneuvering and strategic pressure, the city began to waver. Supplies dwindled, morale faltered, and the promise of clemency and fair treatment under Charles VII persuaded some of Paris's leaders to consider surrender. Joan, however, was careful not to overreach. She understood that premature action could lead to unnecessary bloodshed and political backlash. Patience, she knew, was as much a weapon as the sword. During this period, Joan's visions and spiritual guidance continued to shape her decisions. She claimed to hear the voices of saints instructing her on when to advance and when to hold back, guiding her actions with a sense of moral and divine authority. Whether one viewed these as supernatural or as manifestations of her extraordinary intuition, there was no denying their effect on her leadership. Her confidence, rooted in these convictions, inspired loyalty and courage, even in the most uncertain moments. Despite her successes, not all encounters went as planned. Several assaults were repelled, reminding Joan and her commanders that the enemy was formidable and cunning. Yet each setback was met with reflection, prayer, and renewed determination. She learned to adapt, to anticipate counterattacks, and to use every advantage available, from intelligence gathered by spies to the morale effects of her presence on the battlefield. As the siege drew on, Joan's legend continued to grow.
Songs, poems, and tales spread across France, portraying her as the Maid of Orléans, who had led armies, inspired kings, and challenged the power of England. Her influence extended beyond the battlefield, shaping the hearts and minds of ordinary citizens who had long suffered under war and occupation. They saw in her a symbol of hope, courage, and divine justice, a figure who could turn the tides of destiny.
Ultimately, while the Siege of Paris did not immediately result in the city's capture, it demonstrated the extraordinary capabilities of Joan as a military leader and national symbol. Her strategic brilliance, unwavering faith, and ability to inspire both soldiers and civilians made her a formidable force. At the same time, the political and personal dangers surrounding her grew more pronounced. Envy, fear, and hostility among the nobility foreshadowed future betrayals, while the English and their allies remained ever vigilant, waiting for the moment to strike. By the end of this chapter, Joan of Arc stood at a critical juncture. She had achieved incredible victories, inspired a nation, and guided Charles VII to legitimacy and symbolic triumph. Yet, shadows loomed on the horizon. The path ahead would test her resilience, faith, and courage as never before, forcing her to confront betrayal, capture, and the ultimate trial of her life. The Siege of Paris was both a triumph and a warning, a prelude to the trials that would define her enduring legacy.
Chapter 8. Campaigns Beyond Paris. Glory and Growing Danger. The triumphs in Reims and the tension-laden Siege of Paris had elevated Joan of Arc to legendary status, yet the path ahead was far from assured. With the coronation of Charles VII behind them, the young maid now faced the enormous challenge of consolidating French gains and confronting the entrenched English and Burgundian forces across the country. Her role was no longer merely symbolic. It demanded strategic brilliance, diplomatic finesse, and the unyielding courage that had already defined her extraordinary journey. In the months following her efforts around Paris, Joan spearheaded a series of military campaigns aimed at securing territories still under English or Burgundian control. She was keenly aware that symbolic victories alone could not ensure lasting stability. The French crown required not just legitimacy, but the physical reclamation of towns, fortresses, and regions that had long been lost to the invaders. Every battle, every negotiation, and every march through hostile lands became a test of her leadership, endurance, and divine conviction. Joan's campaigns were marked by her distinctive blend of audacity and calculated risk. She often led her forces personally, riding at the forefront of battles, sword in hand, her standard emblazoned with the fleur-de-lis and the sacred emblems she claimed were divinely revealed to her. Her presence was electrifying, imbuing troops with a courage that defied both exhaustion and the seeming inevitability of English resistance. Soldiers and townsfolk alike viewed her not merely as a commander, but as a living incarnation of divine will, a figure whose faith could tilt the balance of any encounter.
One of her first significant undertakings during this phase was the campaign to liberate the Loire Valley, a region vital for its economic and strategic importance. Towns such as Jargeau, Meung-sur-Loire, and Beaugency became focal points of her military operations. Each victory was hard-won. The English defenders were experienced, well-equipped, and familiar with the terrain. Yet Joan's combination of morale-driven tactics, psychological insight, and the element of surprise proved decisive. Her forces employed innovative strategies, night raids, swift cavalry maneuvers, and targeted assaults designed to cripple enemy morale rather than merely inflict casualties.
The Battle of Jargeau in June 1429 exemplified Joan's brilliance. Leading her forces with unflinching courage, she inspired the troops to scale fortified walls, engage in close-quarter combat, and push back the English defenders. Contemporary accounts describe her fearlessness, noting that she fought at the very front lines, rallying soldiers with cries of divine encouragement. Her personal bravery not only galvanized her army, but also struck terror into the hearts of her enemies, who were unaccustomed to facing a leader who refused to remain behind the lines. The victory at Jargeau was not merely a tactical success. It was a powerful symbol of hope and momentum, demonstrating that the French could reclaim their land through courage and conviction. Following Jargeau, Joan pressed onward to Meurthe-sur-Loire and Beaugency. Each town presented unique challenges: fortified gates, entrenched defenders, and the complexities of navigating both political alliances and civilian populations wary of conflict. Yet Joan approached these campaigns with a combination of tactical ingenuity and moral authority. She sought to minimize civilian suffering while maintaining relentless pressure on enemy forces, ensuring that her campaigns were viewed not merely as conquests, but as righteous acts in the service of God and King.
Throughout these campaigns, Joan's reputation grew exponentially. Tales of her bravery, visions, and invincibility spread rapidly, reaching even distant villages and towns. Her image as the Maid of Orleans, now a seasoned warrior and strategist, inspired volunteers to join her ranks and civilians to provide support, whether through intelligence, supplies, or sanctuary for her forces. However, with growing fame came increased danger. Rival French commanders, uneasy about a peasant girl wielding such influence, began to watch her closely. Some envied her favor with Charles VII, others feared her independence and the potential destabilization of noble hierarchies. Joan navigated these internal tensions with remarkable tact, maintaining focus on her divine mission while quietly deflecting political intrigue. As summer turned to autumn, Joan's forces continued to press forward, culminating in the lifting of the Siege of Orléans' final remnants and the strategic capture of towns along the Loire. These victories significantly weakened English positions in central France and reinvigorated French morale. Her campaigns showcased not only her military genius, but also her understanding of the psychological dimensions of warfare. Towns surrendered more readily in the face of her reputation. English garrisons questioned their own chances against a commander who seemed guided by divine providence. Yet, amid these victories, Joan was acutely aware of the perils surrounding her. Letters from enemies, spies, and even concerned French nobles warned of plots, betrayals, and shifting allegiances. The English, desperate to halt her momentum, intensified efforts to anticipate her movements and cut off her advances. Burgundian forces remained formidable, capitalizing on local knowledge and fortified positions. Joan, ever vigilant, adapted constantly, learning to navigate the treacherous interplay of war, diplomacy, and prophecy. It was during this period that Joan's visions and spiritual guidance continued to shape her actions. She claimed to hear saints instructing her on timing, tactics, and alliances, providing a moral compass and strategic insight that seemed to transcend ordinary understanding. Whether viewed as divine revelation or extraordinary intuition, these experiences reinforced her authority and resolve, allowing her to make difficult decisions with clarity and confidence. Her faith, unwavering even in the face of exhaustion and danger, became the cornerstone of her leadership, inspiring those around her to acts of courage that often defied expectation.
As the campaign season of 1429 progressed, Joan began to contemplate more ambitious objectives. The English-held strongholds in northern France loomed as the next challenge, and the political stakes grew ever higher. The successes along the Loire had shifted momentum, but the journey ahead demanded both boldness and prudence. Every maneuver carried immense risk, and Joan knew that the balance of France's future rested upon her ability to lead, inspire, and survive. Amid the victories and growing legend, cracks in her protective circle began to appear. Rival nobles whispered doubts about her motives, her gender, and her origin. Some feared her influence over Charles VII. Others sought to exploit her rising fame for their own gain. Joan, steadfast and unyielding, continued to focus on the larger mission, but the sense of encroaching danger became undeniable. The maid who had once lifted the Siege of Orléans now faced a new kind of battlefield, one where political intrigue, envy, and treachery would rival the fiercest English sword. By the close of this chapter, Joan of Arc had transformed from a remarkable warrior into a commanding symbol of French resurgence. Her campaigns along the Loire had liberated towns, shattered enemy morale, and strengthened the legitimacy of Charles VII. Yet the forces aligned against her were adapting, observing, and waiting for the right moment to strike. The victories that had once seemed boundless now carried the weight of mounting peril. Joan's path forward promised both opportunity and danger, setting the stage for her eventual capture and the harrowing trials that would define her enduring legacy.
Chapter 9. Betrayal and the Road to Martyrdom. The summer of 1430 carried with it both promise and peril. Joan of Arc, having achieved a string of remarkable victories in the Loire Valley and beyond, had become the living embodiment of French hope and divine favor. Yet, in the intricate web of medieval politics and warfare, triumph often attracted not only admiration, but also envy, fear, and scheming. The maid who had lifted Orleans and led armies into victory now faced the cruelest twist of fate, a betrayal that would mark the beginning of the most harrowing chapter of her life.
As the French forces pressed against the English and Burgundian strongholds, Joan accompanied the army to Compiègne, a strategically vital town on the Oise River. Her presence was a powerful psychological force. Troops believed her to be invincible, and enemies feared the touch of her sword as if it carried a sacred charge. Yet, on the battlefield, human limitations always loomed. Despite her legendary courage, Joan's protective circle of allies and soldiers could not guard against every threat, nor could it shield her from the intricate machinations of political rivals and opportunists. On May 23, 1430, disaster struck. During a skirmish near Compiègne, Joan's forces were ambushed by Burgundian troops, who had been informed of the French positions by covert intelligence. Outnumbered and caught in a sudden encirclement, the French defenders faltered. Joan fought with the indomitable spirit that had defined her career, rallying her men and attempting to repel the attackers. Yet even her courage could not withstand the overwhelming tide. Amid the chaos, she was seized, pulled from her horse, and taken prisoner by the Burgundians. This moment marked the abrupt end of her freedom and the beginning of a nightmare that would test her faith, resolve, and humanity to its limits. Joan's capture sent shockwaves through France. Soldiers who had once drawn strength from her presence were plunged into despair, while towns and allies realized that the embodiment of their hope was now in enemy hands. The Burgundians, understanding her immense value as both a political and symbolic prize, swiftly transferred her to the English, who recognized an opportunity to neutralize the threat she posed and to discredit Charles VII's legitimacy. In the eyes of her captors, Joan was no longer merely a warrior. She was a challenge to their authority, a living testament to divine intervention, and a figure whose downfall would serve as both punishment and propaganda.
From the moment of her capture, Joan's life became a sequence of trials, both physical and spiritual. She was imprisoned in a harsh tower in Rouen, confined in small, damp cells and subjected to constant observation. Her captors attempted to break her spirit through isolation, intimidation, and manipulation, but Joan's courage remained undiminished. She endured hunger, filth, and relentless questioning, sustaining herself with the strength of her faith and the memories of victories past. She believed that God remained with her, that her mission had not ended, and that her suffering had a purpose far greater than herself. The trial of Joan of Arc, which began in January 1431, was meticulously orchestrated by the English and their collaborators. Its aim was to delegitimize her divine claims, undermine Charles VII's authority, and ultimately secure her death as a warning to others. The charges brought against her were wide-ranging, including heresy, witchcraft, cross-dressing, and insubordination to church authority. Each session of the trial was a calculated exercise in psychological torment. Clergy and officials interrogated her relentlessly, seeking contradictions, exploiting uncertainties, and presenting theological arguments designed to confuse and intimidate. Yet Joan's responses were remarkable. She spoke with unwavering conviction, articulating her visions, her divine guidance, and her loyalty to France and God. She refused to renounce her cross-dressing attire, which she defended as a practical measure for modesty and protection in military campaigns. Her words and demeanor continually astonished both her interrogators and observers. They revealed a clarity, intelligence, and fearlessness that defied the conventional expectations of a young peasant girl. Even under immense pressure, Joan remained steadfast, a beacon of integrity and spiritual fortitude amidst the calculated cruelty surrounding her.
The trial was not only a test of her beliefs, but also a stage for political maneuvering. English officials and Burgundian allies sought to extract confessions that could justify execution and delegitimize French resurgence. The inquisitors probed every aspect of her character and actions, attempting to trap her in a contradiction that could be construed as heresy. Joan, however, navigated the proceedings with remarkable skill, maintaining her composure, redirecting questions to higher moral and spiritual principles, and demonstrating an uncanny ability to remain unshaken despite threats, humiliation, and physical discomfort. As the trial progressed, the danger to Joan escalated. The inquisitors, frustrated by her steadfastness, intensified pressure, including isolation, threats of torture, and manipulation of witnesses. Despite these efforts, she remained resolute, insisting that she had been commanded by God and that her mission was righteous. Her unwavering faith confounded her captors and inspired those who secretly supported her, both within France and among sympathetic observers. Yet the political and military stakes left little room for mercy. Her presence as a living symbol of resistance made her execution a priority for her enemies. On May 30th, 1431, the outcome was tragically inevitable. Joan of Arc was condemned as a relaxed heretic, a verdict carefully framed to satisfy both legalistic and political requirements. She was handed over to secular authorities for execution, a process intended to remove any moral ambiguity from the sentence.
That same day, she was led to the stake in the marketplace of Rouen, clad in her simple tunic, her head held high, and her eyes fixed on the heavens. The crowd, a mix of curiosity, awe, and fear, bore witness as the young maid of Orléans faced her final trial: fire. As flames consumed her, Joan's courage did not waver. Contemporary accounts describe her singing hymns and calling upon God until her voice was silenced by the smoke and heat. Her execution was meant to extinguish her influence, but it had the opposite effect. Witnesses were profoundly moved by her bravery, the clarity of her faith, and the dignity with which she faced death. Rather than diminishing her legend, her martyrdom cemented it, creating a narrative that would inspire generations and endure for centuries as a symbol of courage, conviction, and divine justice. Joan's death at the age of 19 was both a tragic loss and a transformative moment for France. Her sacrifices galvanized supporters of Charles VII, strengthened the resolve of French forces, and created a moral and spiritual rallying point that extended far beyond the immediate military gains. Though she had been physically extinguished, her spirit and legacy had become immortal, a testament to the power of conviction, faith, and the courage to defy overwhelming odds in pursuit of a higher purpose. The road to martyrdom had been marked by extraordinary achievements, unrelenting trials, and a profound impact on the course of French history. Joan of Arc, the simple peasant girl who claimed divine visions, had become a figure whose life and death transcended her era, leaving an indelible mark on the collective consciousness of a nation and the world. Her story, both heroic and tragic, would endure as an eternal reminder of the extraordinary potential within ordinary human beings when driven by faith, courage, and an unyielding commitment to justice.
Chapter 10. Legacy of a Saint and Symbol. The death of Joan of Arc in 1431 was meant to mark the end of her influence, yet the story of the Maid of Orleans was far from over. Though her body had been consumed by flames, the spirit of her courage, conviction, and unyielding faith endured, quietly simmering in the hearts of the French people and slowly growing into a legend that would transcend time, geography, and politics. Chapter 10 of her life is not measured by the battles she fought on the fields of France, but by the long and enduring influence she cast upon history, religion, culture, and the very notion of heroism. Almost immediately after her death, whispers began to circulate among the French population. Witnesses of her execution, shocked by the dignity and fearlessness with which she met her end, spoke of her divine presence and miraculous courage. These testimonies, passed from town to town, laid the foundation for a narrative that elevated Joan from a mere mortal warrior to a symbol of righteous defiance against oppression. In villages, marketplaces, and noble courts, people recounted her victories and her words, often adding embellishments that highlighted her saintly qualities. She became, even in death, a source of inspiration, a living myth that carried the hopes of a nation recovering from the chaos of war. Yet the path to full recognition and canonization was neither swift nor simple. The political landscape of France, fractured and cautious, was slow to officially embrace Joan's legacy. King Charles VII, whose throne had been solidified in part due to Joan's interventions, understood the precarious balance of honoring her while not antagonizing allies who had condemned her. For decades, Joan's story was debated, questioned, and sometimes even suppressed, as her role in the French victory over the English carried both political and religious implications. Despite this, the memory of her deeds persisted in local traditions, popular stories, and the oral histories passed down by soldiers, peasants, and clergy who had witnessed the extraordinary impact of her presence firsthand.
The mid-15th century marked the beginning of formal investigations into the legitimacy of her trial. Nearly 2 decades after her execution, efforts were made to re-examine the charges that had condemned her. In 1456, under the papacy of Pope Calixtus III, a comprehensive posthumous retrial was conducted. The meticulous review involved testimonies from hundreds of witnesses who recounted her life, actions, and character. The findings of this retrial were extraordinary. Joan of Arc was declared innocent of all charges, her trial officially nullified, and her reputation restored. She was not merely exonerated, she was canonically vindicated, a recognition that the political and religious authorities who had condemned her had acted unjustly. This formal acknowledgement, occurring decades after her death, solidified her place as both a national hero and a spiritual exemplar. Joan's canonization as a saint would come even later, a culmination of centuries of veneration, devotion, and cultural reverence. In 1920, nearly 500 years after her martyrdom, Pope Benedict XV declared Joan of Arc a saint of the Roman Catholic Church. Her sainthood was not only a religious recognition of her faith and piety, but also a global acknowledgement of her extraordinary courage and moral fortitude. Pilgrims, historians, and devotees flocked to sites associated with her life, including her birthplace of Domremy, the city of Orléans, where she led her armies to victory, and Rouen, where she had met her tragic end. Her life became a focal point for reflection on themes of justice, faith, patriotism, and the extraordinary power of conviction in the face of overwhelming adversity. Beyond religious recognition, Joan's legacy influenced literature, art, and culture worldwide. From illuminated manuscripts of the Middle Ages to Renaissance paintings, dramatizations, novels, and modern films, Joan became a universal symbol of bravery, moral courage, and resistance against tyranny. Artists and writers were captivated by the dramatic arc of her life, from a humble peasant girl to a national savior and martyr, portraying her as both human and heroic, relatable yet larger than life. Her image adorned cathedral walls, statues, and memorials, each work reinforcing her enduring presence in the collective imagination.
Joan's story also sparked philosophical and moral debates. Scholars examined the interplay between divine inspiration and human agency, the ethics of warfare, the role of gender in leadership, and the nature of sacrifice for a greater good. She became a symbol not only for Catholics, but also for secular admirers who recognized the universal lessons of courage, determination, and the power of standing firm in one's beliefs despite societal limitations. Across centuries, leaders, activists, and ordinary people have drawn inspiration from her life, seeing in her an embodiment of resilience and moral clarity that transcends time. Moreover, Joan's influence shaped the very identity of France. She became an emblem of national unity, a rallying point in times of political or military crisis, and a source of pride for a nation that had endured years of turmoil during the 100 Years' War. Her victories, strategic insights, and unyielding spirit came to represent the idea that even the most humble individual, guided by faith and purpose, could alter the course of history. Public ceremonies, commemorations, and national holidays honored her contributions, and she became an inseparable part of France's cultural and historical narrative. In education, Joan of Arc became a case study of extraordinary leadership, courage, and ethical conviction. Her life is taught in schools around the world, not merely as a historical narrative, but as an example of the impact of individual action, the power of belief, and the profound consequences of standing by one's principles. Historians continue to examine her life with increasing nuance, balancing the legendary aspects of her story with critical analysis of the political, social, and religious contexts in which she lived.
The enduring power of Joan's story lies in its universality. It speaks to the human capacity for courage against overwhelming odds, to the resilience of spirit in the face of injustice, and to the transformative impact of faith and conviction. Her life and death challenge individuals to consider the weight of responsibility, the importance of ethical action, and the potential of a single person to inspire change on a vast scale. Joan of Arc's journey, from humble beginnings to battlefield triumphs to imprisonment, martyrdom, and eventual canonization, stands as a timeless testament to the extraordinary potential inherent in human courage and vision. Even today, Joan of Arc remains a beacon of hope and inspiration. Statues in her honor stand in cities around the world, from Paris to New Orleans, as reminders of the enduring power of faith, courage, and moral conviction. Her story continues to resonate in literature, film, and art, challenging each generation to reflect upon the values she embodied and the sacrifices she made. From a small village in Domremy to the hearts of millions worldwide, the life of Joan of Arc demonstrates the extraordinary reach of human potential, the eternal nature of courage, and the timeless relevance of a young woman whose voice, once silenced by fire, continues to speak across centuries. Joan's legacy is, in essence, immortal. She transformed from a mortal warrior into a symbol of divine purpose and human determination. Her life teaches that heroism is not measured merely by victories on the battlefield, but by the steadfastness of spirit, the pursuit of justice, and the unwavering commitment to principles even when faced with insurmountable challenges. As a saint, a symbol, and a historical figure, Joan of Arc remains one of the most powerful examples of the enduring impact a single individual can have on history, culture, and the collective human conscience.